Three, two, one. And we are live. Wherever you are, whatever you are. Thank you for joining the Design of Everyday People live stream, where I talk to senior designers from all over the world and where you get to literally ask them anything. So get your typing fingers ready to drop some questions in the comments as we speak about our topic today. But before that, again, I want to make sure the chat is blowing up and it being very interactive. So I'm going to ask you, where are you tuning to this conversation from? You know, if you want to test my flag knowledge, like always, you can drop an emoji of your flag or just the name of your city, if I can pronounce it. But let's see. Let's have Chris fail at pronouncing your name of your city or what country you're coming from. Anyway, so let's get this started. Let me cue that intro video. This is the design of everyday people.
It sound right, boy.
All right. Well, welcome to How to Turn Your UX Research into Design Decisions. We had our first person drop where they're coming from, Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Chris. Another Chris. What a great name. Okay. We have someone from India, Kolkata. Okay. Test my flag knowledge here. I don't know where that is, Mohammed, but welcome. Okay, I think this is Australia. Oh God, I'm really failing at this. Hamburg, Germany. Okay, all right. So we've got people from all over the world, but keep letting me know where you guys are tuning in from, and I'll flash it on the screen. So yes, welcome again. As I said, I'll start with quick introductions. Like always, I'm Chris, the founder of UX Playbook. Scan this QR code if you want to find out more about that. But before being a founder of UX Playbook, I was a self-taught designer struggling to get into UX. And now I spend most of my time helping designers navigate a fuzzy UX career with UX Playbook, building your first portfolio or leading your first design team and everything in between. But that's enough about me. Today I'm joined by Elizabeth. Sorry, I don't know why I stumbled there. My notes is kind of confusing this morning. Yes, Elizabeth, PhD of psychology, previously a UX researcher at Shopify, founder and principal of her own boutique UX research and training consultancy. So let's get Elizabeth out and find out more about her. Hey, how you doing this morning, Elizabeth?
I'm good. I'm glad you finally got my name there, Chris. I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, I don't know what I wrote, but I was just like, wait, what did I write here?
Yeah.
But thank you for joining so early in the morning. For those who have not heard about you or don't know you, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name is Elizabeth Creighton. I live near Toronto, Canada. I'm a UX researcher. I've been in the field since 2013, which is like, I guess, what, 12 or 13 years ago, I guess. I started off at a UX research consulting firm in Chicago for a few years. I moved to San Francisco and worked at a startup there for a few years as the kind of only researcher leading research there. And then I moved back home to Canada and worked at Shopify for a few years, mostly working on the retail team, which is basically anything related to using Shopify to sell in person at stores or farmers markets or pop-ups or that sort of thing. And then I guess about 7 or 8 years ago now, I decided to go off on my own and start my own business. And so I'm a UX research consultant now. So most of what I do is research projects for clients in all sorts of industries, mostly in the US and Canada, but sometimes in the UK or Australia or other parts of the world. And the kind of way I got into research, as Chris mentioned, was I did a PhD in psychology. Oh, wow, Mohammed, thank you for the compliment. I'm an OG in the field. By the way, I wouldn't have gotten your country right. I saw the flag and I thought Morocco, but I was incorrect. But yeah, I started off with a PhD in psychology, mostly studying kind of how people pay attention to things and remember things, and kind of think through problems. And that kind of relates pretty well to UX research. So I didn't plan back then to go into UX research. I thought I was going to stay in academia and be a professor and have a lab and all that sort of stuff, but then decided that wasn't the path for me, and luckily found UX research as another kind of good place to use my researcher brain, and have been very happy with it ever since. So yeah, kind of I don't know, it feels like a bit of an interesting journey, but also kind of typical, I guess, in some ways. Really happy to be with you guys today and to talk to you about all things research. And thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're the perfect person to speak about this subject with, I find. So before we get started, let me introduce the topic. I just want to remind folks again to drop their questions in. So as we're speaking, if something's confusing or you wanted to follow up, drop your questions in, and we'll try to either weave it into the conversation, or I will bring it up at the end and we can get to it. So without further ado, let me introduce the topic. So I think designers and some of the folks on this call might treat research like a black box. Research for research's sake, analysis paralysis on insights, no clear path from data to decisions. Maybe you create a 47 slide deck that nobody reads. I know I've done that before. Or we need more research just because it's a way to push back and have more time in whatever you're doing, right? So today, I wanted to touch into how we turn research into actual design decisions. Three things we'll be touching on. When is research worth it? And obviously, when it's not. How do we extract real insights and use them? And then the final thing, research methods that don't break the budget. Because I think that's a common thing that folks think when they're like, oh, we need research, but then what is the cost? Or at least maybe some of your PMs think like that. Okay, so why don't we start the question around, how do we even decide whether or not something needs research? Can you share how you think about this, Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, first of all, I just want to do a shout out to my friend Roble Jama, who's joined. I'm glad to have you here. And so, yeah, when is research worth it? That's a really good question. I feel like thinking back to when I first started as a researcher, back then, people weren't always asking for research. It wasn't this like known thing that research is an important part of the design process. And so it's actually kind of nice in a way that nowadays people are always like, oh, we should do some research first. Or like, oh yeah, we got to do research. This needs research. But the kind of negative part of that is really, not everything needs research. We won't have time to do research for every sort of little design problem we're trying to solve. And we really need to kind of learn, I guess, how to prioritize when research is important and when it's not, right? And so one way I like to think about this is kind of on two different sort of dimensions. One is risk, and one is knowledge. So basically risk is, like if we didn't do research and we kind of went ahead with whatever we're kind of thinking right now, what would happen if we're wrong, right? If we're taking a guess and we're wrong about that guess, how big are the consequences? Is this like a show-stopping thing for our company, or is it something that's not really that big of a deal if we kind of go down the wrong path first and we can kind of correct and it's not really that big of a thing? And the other kind of dimension I think about is knowledge, which is like, how much do we know about this already? Do we already have research we can draw on? Do we already have like a good reason to think that, things are going to be, going in a certain direction? We might have some knowledge we can draw on that we don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel every time we work on something. And so there's actually an activity that I like to do. I actually learned it when I was at Shopify from a person there named JB Booth. It's called the Assumption Slam, and it's an activity I like to do when I'm working with a new team and they don't necessarily know where to start with research. So what you do, it's kind of hard to explain, but I'll try to do it. You kind of make a little grid. And so there's two axes. One is risk, high to low. One is knowledge, high to low, right? So you kind of have an axis 2 by 2. And you kind of, individually or maybe in small groups, you get a stack of sticky notes and you start writing down any assumptions you have about your users or about your product, whatever, like our users really need this, or our users hate when we do this, things like that. And you just kind of write down as much as you can think of things you're already thinking about your users or your product, or you feel like maybe leadership at your company thinks about your users or your product that might not be correct, might be correct, who knows. You write those all down, you get together in the group with your team, and you start placing them on this grid. So you kind of create a conversation where you're like, okay, we have this sticky note here. Where does it belong on the grid? Is it like a high risk or low risk? Is it high knowledge or low knowledge? And you kind of go through this exercise that can be kind of like a little political and contentious sometimes because people will have different opinions about where it goes. So that's actually like a great exercise for almost like team building as well, to kind of get behind where these different sticky notes should go. And then ideally you end the session, might take a few hours, but you end the session with your sticky notes on your grid and a really good idea of where the kind of ripest questions are for research. And for me, this is the things that are like high risk and low knowledge, right? It's really bad if we get it wrong and we also don't know anything about it, right? So this is where I'd want to start as a researcher or as a designer who wants to do some research. And from there, I can move on to the other quadrants. But usually, like, I can get a whole year's worth of road mapping or at least a quarter's worth, from that exercise, right? And so those are the kind of two dimensions I think about most is, what is the most risky and where's our biggest blind spot? Where do we not know anything, right? Another kind of, I guess, like thing I think about when it comes to prioritizing research is, will we actually use the results of the research? So I've been in situations before where a PM has asked for research for something, but then when I actually ask some questions about how it's going to be used, he's just considering it like a ticking the box sort of thing. Like, we need to do the research, but actually the release is happening so soon that we're not going to have time to act on the results of the research, right? And so this is a frustrating situation for anyone who's doing research. It's like, who wants to put in all the work of doing good research and then find out that nothing's going to actually come of it? So that's something I want to kind of make sure I, kind of square away before I take the time to do research. And I guess just in general, I feel like where I can have the most impact as a researcher is situations where I guess we're being more proactive than reactive. So it's kind of maybe simpler or easier to kind of do reactive research where it's like, oh, we've heard some negative feedback and we need to figure out, like what's behind the negative feedback. Like that's fine too. But I find that like I have a bigger impact when I can do the kind of higher level research, like a lot of the kind of more generative stuff, like where should we be going next as a company? What is the next direction for our product? Like more kind of high level, like directional stuff. And the kind of, more nitty gritty stuff, like should the app use green or blue, or should the button be here or there? That could be important too, but it's maybe less of a high level impact than the kind of deeper questions. So those are kind of, as a researcher, the sorts of things I think about. But also, honestly, like, especially if you're not a consultant like me and you're working at a company, there might be political considerations as well. Like maybe just because of your job and your role, there's certain people, to some extent you have to kind of keep informed or keep happy. And so there might be some degree of like kind of political playing there as well. I would say, try to keep that to a minimum and try to, voice your own kind of opinions as a smart researcher or designer, because, just because the CEO wants you to do research on something doesn't actually mean it's a good idea, but you should kind of keep that in mind as an input to your directions as well.
Yeah, I really like the framework of the assumption slam or the activity with risk and knowledge. Have you found that as a consultant, there is definitely some groundwork you need to do in terms of risk and knowledge where you're helping facilitate map this exercise? Or could you come in completely unbiased and leverage the team's existing knowledge on these assumptions, and then you find out like, okay, this is interesting, and then you guide them to I guess a consensus? Have you found, or do you need some background information there? Because I can imagine if a junior would want to run this, but they're like, I don't really know what the risk is, and trying to facilitate that could be quite
Yeah.
a bit of a blocker for them.
Yeah, no, totally. And it is a bit harder sometimes as a consultant because every client I work with is different, and like different, industries and stuff. I don't know what the biggest problems are, for their company. I just haven't been there very long. So yeah, I mean, as part of my work, I usually have to do some degree of kind of like knowledge base building, reading documents they send me, or, kind of doing kind of research on what it is they do and their kind of history, maybe looking at market research, on them, like all that kind of stuff. Yeah, as a junior, it can be hard because you might not be able to have a very strong voice yourself because you just don't really know yet, where these little sticky notes should go. I think, what can be helpful is having a good range of people in the group. So what you wouldn't want it to just be yourself and other fellow juniors. You'd ideally want there to be like, maybe your manager, the design director, whoever else you think like should really be having a voice in this, because it's probably going to, determine your research roadmap for the next little while. And so one thing I kind of in general advocate for is like bringing stakeholders into the research process as much as possible, because you don't want to surprise them later with something that they might nitpick, like, hey, wait a minute, you did that research, why didn't you ask about this, or why didn't you do this instead, all that kind of stuff. And if you can bring in some of those stakeholders into the assumption mapping, assumption slam exercise, you can kind of get ahead of those questions and also make them feel like they're having an impact, and they actually are, right? They're, especially if they've been to the company for a long time, they might be the best people to kind of think of these assumptions because they are steeped in them, right? And I think one thing that can kind of be difficult is to like get people to sort of just kind of go with their gut and write down whatever they've heard, or felt themselves, without feeling like, they're kind of going to say something wrong or whatever. JB, the person who created this exercise, she actually likes to start with a like improv warm-ups, like where they have, ideally you're in person doing this together. Of course, you can do it over Zoom or whatever, maybe use Miro for your sticky notes. But like she likes to do some kind of improv warm-up exercises, like for example, where like you pretend you have a ball of energy and then you throw it to someone else and they catch it and they do something with it and throw it to someone else. It's kind of silly stuff, but it kind of gets you comfortable with each other and comfortable kind of like doing quick things and going with your gut and not thinking too hard, because I think that's kind of an important part of getting those assumptions down on paper. And then it can be really helpful to have people in the group who are kind of maybe more senior to sort of help give context as to why they, like, I think this is really risky, and that's because like Mary, the CEO, told me last week that X, Y, and Z, they might have kind of context to bring the conversation. So yeah, I would say like try to have a diverse group of people and try to make sure everyone feels comfortable writing down whatever is on their mind, even if it might be, wrong. We can still work with it and play around with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I know in like the design sprint or the lightning decision jam, there's always like a voting process, right? Like silent voting. Is it important in this exercise, the assumption slam, to have a decision maker? Or do you really want that conversation to surface and the team's agreement? Because it could be relatively difficult, right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You're asking really good questions, Chris. I feel like, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like it can be helpful to have someone who's the ultimate decision maker, maybe the person who really is the ultimate decision maker. Like maybe it is like the PM or the director or someone who's going to be the one who's like signing off on this research or not. And so maybe if you're kind of arguing about where exactly the sticky note goes or which sticky note you should tackle first as a researcher or a designer, they're the one who kind of says, what, like, understanding what I know about the company's priorities, I really think we should go with X rather than Y, and maybe you guys still talk about it. But yeah, I think that it could be helpful that they don't necessarily have to, if they're maybe not available for that meeting, you could always, talk to them later or create a document where you kind of lay out like, hey, here were the 5 assumptions that were like the highest risk, lowest knowledge, the ones I think are the most important. How would you rank them? And, and why? Let's kind of talk through what I should tackle first, as a researcher. That can be helpful.
Yeah, I think I might run this assumption slam with my team
Mhm.
for like lots of directional stuff, but also like immediate things that we could do or could go dig some knowledge in. Yeah, I really like that. It's really simple framework as well. Just a 2x2 grid with risk and knowledge. Is that right?
Yeah, and if you Google it, so there used to be a really great article from the Shopify blog called, I think it was called like how, like Assumption Slam, how not to make an ass out of you and me. And I think they took it down recently, and maybe the Shopify blog doesn't exist anymore. But if you just Google JB Booth, like Booth, and Assumption Slam, you should be able to find, people have referenced her, so you should be able to find a version of it somewhere. But yeah, 2x2 grid, risk and knowledge are usually what people label them with, but you could choose slightly different words if you want.
Perfect. Okay. If there's anybody helpful in the chat, drop that link if you find it. So it can help everybody else. I'll definitely do that. Later if I'm not with my hands full hosting this. But okay,
Yeah.
let's move on to the next question. Okay, so even if we decide like we need research, we don't always have the sort of time and budget to do it effectively. What things do you think about when executing different types of research with limited time and budget? Like what is,
Mhm.
I guess, in consideration, or how do you typically approach this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing that's kind of nice about doing research these days is it is generally a lot cheaper than it used to be. When I think about when I first got started in the field and there was a lot more in-person research and like traveling around and renting facilities and things, research was super expensive. Now, since so much can be done remotely or even with like what's the word I'm looking for? Like asynchronous platforms. Like not everything has to be done synchronously. There's situations where you can have people, for example, do small user tests on their own time, and you don't have to be there live moderating it, that kind of thing. So things have gotten cheaper, but they're still expensive, and time is still a thing, no matter what, right? Yeah. So if I'm in a situation where I have limited time and budget, one thing I think about a lot is recruiting and ways to make that easier. So I find that participant recruiting can be the most expensive part and the most time consuming part of a lot of research projects. Luckily these days there's a lot of tools that can help. One that I use quite a lot is user interviews. So userinterviews.com. They're great. It's a really great platform. You kind of plug in your kind of screening questions or your recruiting questions. You try to kind of narrow in exactly who you're looking for. They'll come up with a list of candidates. You can review them one by one and approve or deny them. For me, that's usually within budget for all of my clients, but that might not be the case, especially people in different parts of the world with different purchasing power, things like that. I think it works out to about $50 a participant. So like that can be considered cheap or expensive depending on where you live. I find it's a really quick way of recruiting. So usually I can set up my screener and I'll have everybody I need by like the end of the day or maybe the next day, which is fantastic. If I'm in situations where I have to recruit a more specialized population, like for example, if I'm doing research with doctors, they're probably not on userinterviews.com waiting to be contacted for a study. And so in that case, I might have to use a professional recruiting firm who does charge a lot more money and needs more time to do that kind of recruiting. But maybe, most people on this call probably don't need that sort of thing. But anyway, recruiting services like user interviews or Respondent is another one. Tools like Listna and many other ones have their own panels as well. That's a kind of really good time saver and, in some cases, money saver. There's also, I find that, I do almost all of my research just over Zoom. I run user interviews over Zoom. It's quite easy. I do pay for an annual, whatever professional membership or something. It's probably like $100 or $200 a year. I don't know. That I use for everything, even usability testing. So Zoom has a feature where you can not just share your screen with the other person, but also share control of your keyboard and mouse. And so I'll pull up a prototype on my screen and give them control of my keyboard and mouse, and they can click around on it, and I can do my usability test that way, which is great because that way I don't even ever have to give them access to the prototype on their computer. It's good for like confidentiality and stuff. And so that's a tool that I use that kind of makes things, faster, cheaper, whatever. There's also, a bunch of different research methods you can use. For example, surveys are a research method you can use that generally are really good for when you want to save time. You can like write a survey and get responses really, really quickly. The kind of issue is that a survey is not always the best research method to use, depending on what research question you have, right? Surveys are really good when you want to know, like, how many people think a certain thing or do a certain thing, right? It's good for like understanding the, proportion of people in your group who think a certain way, behave a certain way, do a certain thing, whatever. Because you want your survey questions to mostly be, multiple choice or true or false, things like that. Easy kind of questions to answer. Not so much of like the long answer, write a whole big thing. That's when you start to write a survey and you have a lot of those types of questions, really you probably want to do a user interview instead, so you can actually get, more data there. But depending on what your research question is, a survey could be a good method that could be relatively cheap and quick to pull off. I think that, like, with any sort of research method, one thing I struggle with as a researcher is like, when is it okay to use like friends and family recruiting, which is usually the cheapest and easiest way to kind of get participants, right? And I have mixed feelings about this. Sometimes you're in a situation where you literally have no budget and you really have nothing you can do besides ask people that in those situations, I generally push people to look for, maybe rather than friends and family, it's more like friends of friends, like acquaintances, things like that, asking people to kind of like ask around in their, social networks, things like that. The reason why friends and family isn't so good, just, for people who don't know, is, if they know you well and they know maybe you've been working on something for a long time, they're probably less likely to give, critical feedback on what you've been working on. They also, just because they know you and they know your company, they might know things about your company's business model and how your company operates that the average person wouldn't know. So not really like a good, candidate user. And also, again, depending on what kind of product you're working on, like the ideal user might be different from your friends and family, right? So like, for example, if you're working on an app that's for pregnant women, and your friends and family are not pregnant women, maybe you need to kind of do a bit more work to find people who fit that profile instead, right? There's only so much, like like I was talking about, for doctors, for example. There's only so much you can do trying to do a usability test on something for doctors with a regular layperson, right? It's just not going to work very well. So those are kind of considerations around recruiting. But yeah, there's also, platforms like usertesting.com and other kind of similar platforms where you can kind of set up, usually a relatively simple prototype, user test, and kind of, send it out into the world and get, 5 or 10 or 20 or whatever little video responses. And that can be good in some situations. I'd say that, like, I almost always prefer to do things moderated, as in, like, I'm there, virtually or in person, talking to the person, asking questions, seeing what their confusion is in real time. But if I'm in a situation where I don't have that luxury, then potentially, if it's something really, simple and straightforward, setting things up on a platform like that can be helpful. I think you just have to kind of be careful about people who sort of almost like do user testing like professionally, like they just kind of breeze through prototypes, don't leave a lot of feedback, they just want to get through and collect their money, and that can be difficult to kind of weed out ahead of time. So pros and cons there, I guess. Also, I feel like I've been just like talking. I'll stop talking.
No, it's good. Like, definitely. Are you a fan of like kind of guerrilla testing, where you're like, let's just say your building's on top of a mall, and then you go downstairs and you're like, well, my users are, using this, let's just say, like, banking app, and like,
Yeah.
where, like, would you be a fan of that? Like, it's kind of moderated, but it's also on the fly. Do you think there's much value in just like showing people and letting people play and just initial reactions? Or do you think that's kind of like, if it's not, hyper moderated, then why do that? Any
Yeah.
thoughts there?
Yeah, I've done that before when I worked at a startup in San Francisco. They didn't have a big budget. We did a bit of that because it was like a product like for tech workers. There's a lot of tech workers in San Francisco. It makes sense. Yeah, in limited kind of situations, I think that could work. I think, like, if what you're working on is something that really is like the sort of thing that many people in the world are like kind of part of your target audience, like it really is just sort of for like the general population, then that could be fine. Because I think the thing that you sort of might have to worry about is you're encountering these people in the mall or on the street or whatever, and like if you're working on something for doctors, you're not going to encounter a lot of doctors, right? So if it is something that's kind of more for the general population, that could be okay. I would say that, like, one thing I worry about with guerrilla research is it kind of suggests this idea of like, maybe you haven't really done much planning as well. It's like, oh, let's just go downstairs and go ask some people about this. Whereas I always advocate for people who are doing research to create some sort of research plan, whether that's like very formal or not, like at least having a list of, what do we actually want to learn from this? Like, what is the point of doing this research? And maybe also, like, what actual questions do we want to ask people? Because one thing I worry about with, guerrilla research, if it's like extremely casual, is, letting more of that biasing language to kind of creep in, not asking a lot of open-ended questions, being a little bit too kind of forceful, not being very consistent in what you're asking people, because you're just kind of thinking of things on the fly. Not that you have to ask the same questions to everybody all the time, but, having some consistency there. So I think, like, using a guerrilla method is okay if you can maybe access the right people that way, as long as you still are just kind of not just running out and doing it immediately, and maybe taking some time to think about what you want to do.
Yeah, I interviewed for a company a while back, and they had like customer Fridays or something, where
Okay.
every single Friday they would invite 5 to 10 people in their user base, some friendlies or just kind of out of a hat or whatever, and they would, show them a prototype or show them something
Right.
or ask them something. How do you feel about that kind of research culture? Or do you think it's just like research for research sake, or it's a good foundation, but again, going back to the research plan, being more strategic about like, why are they here, versus like, let's just show it to some people and see what happens? Like, what do you feel about that? Did
Yeah.
Shopify have a culture like this?
I don't think we ever had like just kind of a regular, back when I worked there, I had like a regular rotating, like, oh, people come in at a certain time or whatever, but they
Yeah.
might do that now. I'm not sure. But yeah, there's like pros and cons to that. I think like the nice thing about that sort of approach is it makes research very visible, especially if people are actually physically coming in. Like when I worked at the startup in San Francisco, like I ran some research in person in the office, and it was like a big deal. It was like the first time they've ever had like users come into the office, and like everyone was like, "Oh, it was like so cool." And that kind of thing can be nice to sort of like show like, "Hey guys, like these are our real customers. We do research, that sort of thing." Like that's really neat. I like that aspect of it. One thing I find that companies who try to do this, like, problem they run into is like, if you're interviewing 10 people a week or whatever, that's a lot of work. Like that's kind of a lot of work. And to actually, plan those interviews, run those interviews, analyze them, actually use the results. Like it just doesn't happen. Like I feel like, especially if you're trying to do it on a weekly cadence, like it could be one person's job just to do, just to do that endless cycle, which probably would get really tedious after a few months, right? You're just kind of constantly in this like treadmill of running these sorts of interviews. And I do kind of wonder if like I worry that like some companies are really gung-ho about doing research, but they don't actually like then do anything about the the results, right? And like if you're kind of like constantly getting this stream of data, it can feel like you're doing something really important, but then you're not actually using it if you don't have time to like kind of consolidate it and think through what the insights are. So like I feel like some companies could benefit from having a sort of balanced approach. By maybe, maybe on like a monthly or every other week, basis, you have a certain number of people come in and you kind of have a set, prototype you'd like to show them or whatever iteration, and that's cool. But I also like, and again, this could be my bias as like a research consultant, like I think that like project-based research is really important too, where we kind of like thought about like, all right, what is like the research problem we're trying to solve, or the design problem we're trying to solve? What are the research questions? Like let's run a dedicated sprint of research on this particular problem or whatever. And I think that's important to have as well. Like I really like to kind of make sure that we're not, I mean, research is really never a waste of time, but like I could imagine that, the amount of time and money you're spending running this kind of continuous revolving set of, interviews could maybe be better spent deciding what is the actual highest priority thing to learn about, and then like dedicating, time to learning about that. So good and
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing that you said was like having a dedicated like sprint. So do you think that to not over research or to overdo it or to generate too much data for us to act on, it's important to be like, let's time box this. Let's actually have a finish line. Otherwise, we can always collect endless data.
Mm.
Is that important?
Is it, I feel like it's important to me, but maybe it's not important to everybody. I feel like I always like to start a project with, a kind of guess in terms of like how many people I'd want to include, and what topics we want to include, with the idea that like that could change if we learn something that we need to investigate further. Like maybe I, just because I've run user interviews, for example, a million times, and like, okay, like let's start with like 15 and kind of see how we feel at the end of those 15. And if we kind of do those 15 and feel like we still have some blind spots, we can tack on another 5, or something like that. I feel like that's generally how I like to operate, because usually the people I'm working with have deadlines and things, so they kind of want some sort of answer by a certain date, and maybe it's not the perfect answer and we want to kind of gather more data, and that's fine, but they usually like to have some sort of time box around it.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's kind of generally how I like to do it. Though there's also some types of research I do that like might take longer. Like I've definitely worked on projects where that have been a bit more like kind of like foundational, like, hey, we've never talked to our users before, like who are these people, what do they need, like what are their kind of deep problems, whatever. And that might be a kind of more like ongoing kind of, or at least longer term kind of type of research. So maybe as a researcher, I'm running some kind of smaller, slightly more like tactical like research projects that are dedicated to certain questions, but then I also may be running a kind of slower kind of research thingy where like I might have a larger number of interviews, like trying to get a very diverse sample of people, and asking kind of like pretty high level questions, but it might take a longer time to kind of complete that. So I might have different types of projects on different timelines. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so let's just say that we use the assumption slam, and
Mhm.
we say, okay, this topic needs research, and we figure out, okay, a good enough time and budget for this research. How do we figure out? Well, okay, on that note, like time and budget, but like, how do we figure out? You know, what the actual insight from that research is to then move to design decisions. Are there some signals that we need to look for? How do you think about like, oh, that's really interesting versus that is noise?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, analyzing research is like, I think it's like the hardest thing for people to kind of learn how to do, and it can be, it can be tedious. Thankfully, there's a lot of tools out there to help us these days. I feel like when I first got started, it was like I would make like an Excel sheet or something like that, or like just use a Word document. Yeah. So I find that like let's take for example, um, you've done a set of 10 user interviews and you're kind of trying to figure out what did we learn from this, right? I typically use Dovetail. There's a lot of tools like that, and what I tend to do is I will take all of the recordings or the transcripts or whatever from the interviews, put them into Dovetail, and I'll kind of walk through each one, just kind of skim through and highlight anything that I think is potentially interesting. So my first step is kind of like taking this big long transcript and kind of grabbing the little like nuggets or observations, whatever you want to call them, like little like, okay, I want to make sure we kind of save that for later. And it takes a bit of time, but I'll go through and highlight them all. And then I put them into a little like canvas on Dovetail. And what I'll do is I'll have these little highlights tagged with different themes. So like, maybe I have some highlights around pain points or, around, onboarding, things like that, whatever kind of topics people talked about. And I'll have Dovetail use its AI kind of feature to take all of the tags, all of the highlights that were tagged with onboarding, for example, and sort them into different themes, right? So maybe there's like, one theme that was like, the second step of onboarding was really confusing, or one that was like, people don't want to give their gender in onboarding, or things like that, right? And I find that AI, little boost is really helpful for me to get a first sense of what the kind of potentially interesting themes are. And so that's the kind of like I feel like I think Ruby Pryor, who's another researcher who I know, and I think you might know too, Chris, she had a kind of good way of saying it, which is like observations are things that raise questions and insights are things that answer questions. And so like when we're kind of just thinking about like, oh, here's some interesting stuff and some interesting themes, if you were to talk to people about that would probably just raise more questions than like, okay, well, but why did that happen? Or like, who cares? Like, what's the point of that? That kind of thing. And so I kind of think of like the insight creating thing as trying to figure out how to answer those questions that the observations are raising for me. And usually the way I do that is just by kind of steeping myself in everything I've heard, looking across different themes, trying to find connections, things like that. And usually when I'm kind of creating insights, I'm thinking about either the cause or the impact or both. So like this thing happened, okay, like why did that happen? And then who cares why that happened? What was the what do we learn from that? What's the kind of thing, what's the impact, I guess. There's an example I use. So I have a course I teach on user interviews, and there's an example I used, and I forget the exact wording, but it was, kind of a fake. Imagine you were doing research for Airbnb and you kind of interviewed people on their vacation habits and stuff. And you kind of, you had one theme that you found around, people talking about how budget constraints are something they think about when they're traveling, and maybe some other kind of themes. And, if you were just to kind of, if you just wanted to kind of talk about, kind of, I guess, money and how that factors into, into people's vacation plans, that's not particularly interesting. But maybe through this research, we found that like, because people have, particular budget constraints, they actually didn't find much on Airbnb that suited their needs because they didn't understand how to use the filters to find, different properties that were within their budget, for example. I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, but like, it's kind of like going one level deeper and kind of trying to figure out like, given that this happened, why should we care as a company that this happened? Like, well, we should care because if people are not able to find things that fit their budget, they're not going to use our platform. They're going to use something else, or they're just going to get confused and get annoyed or whatever, right? So that's kind of one way I would sort of go about trying to find an insight, is like thinking about the cause and the impact. The first UX research job I had was at a consulting firm, and we had to do a lot of those like 47 slide decks, like you said, Chris. And I mean, and the research was really good, but we often had to write huge decks. And one of the requirements when we were writing slides was each, the headline, the top of an insight slide had to include both the cause and the impact, which is a lot to try to cram into like two lines, right? So like, for example, because of their budget constraints, some people, had a lot of issues finding what they were, looking for on Airbnb. And as a result, they said that they would likely try a different platform instead, something like that. Right. So yeah, I don't necessarily advocate for people trying to cram everything into every, headline on every slide. But I feel like when you're trying to make a case to stakeholders or clients or whatever, like you do want them to understand really quickly, like not just like what happened, but also why, and why should they care? Like, I think the really most important thing is why should they care, and then what should we do about it, right? Then like what should the design decision be to kind of answer that question.
Yeah, yeah. That completely makes sense. I like the cause and impact, and also why should whoever's reading the research care, or why should we care as a
Right.
company, or yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. I love that you guys are helping each other out, dropping
Yeah.
in lots of links, uh, and yeah, great. Assumption mapping. Yeah, exactly. Thank you guys for being so helpful. All right. Well, let's move on to the Ask Me Anything. So here is the portion of this live stream where you guys can ask anything you want to Elizabeth about research and beyond. Right. So I will start and just kind of get us warming up. Um, Apart from the assumption slam framework that you sort of inherited from your colleague at Shopify, tell us about the research culture at Shopify, because I'm very fascinated to know, because obviously Shopify is this massive successful company, is doing really really well. How was working in, you know, a research place, like department in Shopify? Were you centralized or dispersed, or was it a hybrid of both?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I worked at Shopify quite a while ago, like 7 or 8 years ago, and things have
Okay.
definitely changed since when I worked there.
Yeah.
Any Shopify ex-Shopify people on the call might understand. So when I worked there, it was fantastic. I mean, we had a great research team. I think when I started, I was like the fourth or fifth. And then by the time I left, there was like over 20 of us, I think.
Hmm.
And so usually the way we worked was we were kind of within like a product team. So the main product team I was part of was the retail team. So anything related to selling in person with Shopify. So I really like that because I got to do a lot of in-person research with like credit card readers and receipt printers and, you know, things like that, where you're kind of physically in a person's space. And so, yeah, that's like typically how the researchers worked, was like embedded within, you know, a team that had, you know, a PM and various designers and content strategists and, you know, other kind of roles, developers, of course, and things like that. And
Hmm.
and I think like when I first started there, it was pretty much like the researcher did the research and passed it on. But by the time I left, it was a lot more like involving the designers and the content strategists was a lot more of a thing, which was fantastic. I really like working with the designers that I worked with. And so, for example, like we would go to different stores in Toronto that use Shopify, and we would like go and run interviews at the stores or run usability testing, and they would kind of come along as like note takers, or we would take turns doing the interviews, kind of like I would be kind of coaching them a little bit, I guess, on how to do research, which is great. I mean, I feel like you know, more and more researchers becoming a part of what designers are expected to be able to do, but they often don't get the training to do it well. I mean, I feel like a lot of research stuff like interviews and surveys, they're the sorts of things that everyone's familiar with, so everyone can do it to some extent without any training, but it really does kind of take someone helping you to kind of understand how to do it, you know, to kind of level up your skills basically, right? And so it was nice to kind of be embedded within the design teams there and kind of get to kind of coach designers on doing some research, which was awesome. And then yeah, so we kind of had like a nice like research team culture, and then like also the kind of, you know, you're with your product team and that kind of culture, which was great. I mean, things have changed a lot since I've left there. I actually don't think Shopify has a research team anymore.
Oh,
Yeah, or maybe they have sort of researchers, but they call them something else. I don't know. I feel like I can't really speak about it too much, but I just know that like the research team, as I once knew it, is not a thing at Shopify anymore.
right.
But they must be doing some research because they still come out with, you know, cool stuff. So
Yeah,
actually, can I tell like one of my favorite research stories from Shopify?
absolutely. Yes.
So when I worked there, there was a new credit card reader that was coming out, and this was again a long time ago. And I was with the industrial designer who had worked on the prototype, and some of the other other designers, and we'd gone to, I forget if it was like a, not a farmer's market, but some sort of pop-up, you know, event. And we kind of had planned to meet with different vendors there and kind of have them try to set up the credit card reader and pretend like they would, you know, were using it. And so we get there and we, you know, bring the credit card reader, And we realized something really interesting, which is that the credit card reader pairs to your phone with Bluetooth, right? Which is kind of a typical thing people use Bluetooth for, microphones and headphones and all that kind of stuff, right? And if you've ever used Bluetooth, at least with an iPhone, I've never had an Android, so I'm not sure. You typically go to like the Bluetooth kind of area in your settings, right? You go to settings, Bluetooth, pair there. Well, that's not how this worked. You actually had to download a Shopify app, and you paired the credit card reader within the Shopify app. And nobody got this. Every single person we kind of tried to run this exercise with could not figure it out. And all but one of them basically ultimately said, like, my next step would be calling customer support, because I really don't know what I would do. They had no clue how to, they basically would open up their Bluetooth settings, be like, it's not showing up. And when I kind of try to probe them on, like, well, is there anything else you could try? All that kind of stuff. They'd have no idea. And so I was excited to present this, back to the, whoever it was I was working with. And they were interested too, because the idea is, like, people have this really strong mental model that, like, Bluetooth stuff happens in your Bluetooth settings, not in this other app that you're not familiar with. And it turns out that for various reasons, I'm not even sure exactly, they end up not being able to make the change. Like, I was kind of advocating for, like, we have to let people set this up in the way that they're kind of used to. For some reason, they weren't able to. I forget what the limitation was, but they're kind of like, well, we're just going to have to kind of go with it and, sort of see what happens. And, like, not that I like when people have a bad experience, but I did feel kind of vindicated when I found out later that, like, the volume of customer support calls specifically for that credit card reader was, like, super high relative to, normal, because of that exact issue that I identified through the research. And so that it's kind of like a cool story because I found something cool, but it's also not a great story because it was a situation where I did this great research that then ultimately was not able to have an impact aside from being able to go, haha, I told you so, guys, later, which was not very useful, I don't think. So anyway, I see questions are coming in. I should, stop telling this funny story.
Yeah, I'll flash it on the screen. So,
Okay.
question, can you share top tips for research portfolios, including how long should case studies be, and what are the main things to highlight?
That's a good question. So I should start off by saying that I do not have a portfolio. So sometimes I think these days researchers are maybe expected to have portfolios. I haven't had like a job, like an employer job in a long time. So I have not had to make a portfolio. Though if you go to my website, which I think is QR coded somewhere, maybe it's www.brazen, BRAZEN.io. There's a page there we go, there's the QR code. There's a page with my case studies. So I do have case studies up on my website. I don't know if they're the best case studies. That's just how how I've chosen to do them. I would say that, like, and again, like, I haven't had to hire someone in a long time. I haven't had to go to a job interview in a long time. I feel like I keep mine relatively short and simple. The idea being that people can ask more questions if they have more questions. I think there's probably two most important parts of a case study. One is kind of trying to explain what problem it was you were trying to solve. Like, what was the context? Why were you doing this research? What were you kind of potentially trying to do? Then the other most important thing is, what was the impact of the research? Like, what actually changed? Did a metric, increase? Did, you get great feedback from customers? Like, whatever it was that happened as a result of the research, and you kind of, get in front of some other problem and stop it from happening, all that kind of stuff. So I would say, like, setting up the context and, like, the purpose of the research really nicely, and then setting up the kind of impact of the research as well. And all the other kind of details, like, you don't need to talk for paragraphs and paragraphs about how you did 12 interviews instead of 15, and how, you use this tool to analyze it and whatever. Sure, you can include that if you want to, but I think the most important stuff is, like, those two, kind of the beginning and the end, sort of. Yeah.
Okay, let's flash this one. This one's a bit long, so it's cut off, but I'll try and see if I can read it here. Let me move that into the middle of the screen. What if the company never is comfortable in investing in research or user testing platform? I've created a dashboard/portal for the internal employees for big or small companies, but never been able to test it with the actual user. And it is so painful to see that we still take feedback from decision-making stakeholders to tweak design.
I'm sorry. This is from Himani. I'm sorry, Himani. That really sucks. I've been in those situations before where you just know that you need you need to talk to people, you need to do research, and you just don't have the support to do that. I find that, like, this can kind of happen for two reasons. One is, they don't want to spend the time or the money to do research. I guess maybe 3 reasons. They don't want to spend the time and money to do research. They're not familiar with what research is or why it's important. And also maybe they're kind of protective of their users. So some companies don't want you to actually test with their real users. They don't want to bother them, especially if it's a company that has a relatively small number of users because it's a very specialized product. They don't want to kind of constantly be hassling people to do research. So those are kind of 3 different roadblocks that I've certainly encountered. And there's not always a lot you can do because you're not, always empowered to like make these decisions yourself. I feel like, in some cases, trying to kind of almost like tell a story or set up the idea of like, what's the kind if we don't get the answers we're looking for, what is sort of the alternative reality that we're facing, right? So it's like if we did research, we would learn about X, Y, and Z. If we don't do research, we're guessing about X, Y, and Z. And these are actually really risky guesses to make for whatever reason, right? This kind of harkens back to my assumption slam activity where it's like, okay, you kind of have these assumptions that are maybe really risky and we don't know much about. And okay, so what happens if we don't learn about this stuff? And maybe these are really big negative consequences for your company, right? And so sometimes you can kind of sell people on research by being like, sure, it'll cost us X $100 or X $1,000 to do this research, but it could potentially save us tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars if we kind of are going, if we're taking that research and actually using it to go down the right path, right? This is another way I kind of advocate sometimes for doing research earlier rather than later. So I feel like I have a much better, bigger impact when I can do the research to kind of help define the product direction rather than wait till the product's already developed and do a bit of testing to, to kind of figure out the nitty gritty details. Because who cares if you have a beautiful, app if it's not actually solving a problem for people, right? And so I feel like, thinking about the kind of, dashboards and portals and stuff you might have been creating, right? Like who even knows if you don't talk to people, whether you're actually presenting the right data or data that people can actually understand. Maybe it's a totally useless, dashboard or portal if people can't interpret it very well. And I don't know what kind of, resistance you're facing at your company, but it sounds like there might just have to be a lot of kind of explanation and handholding about, what could happen if this is not a useful product or it actually makes people's lives worse. Or maybe your customers actually make bad decisions because they're interpreting the data incorrectly and what could be the result of that, right? And it sounds like you're still getting feedback from stakeholders on your designs when maybe that feedback is not informed by any sort of research. Again, that's difficult and there's probably only so much you can push back. It's always hard when you work in a company trying to balance like advocating for yourself while also not getting fired. There's kind of like this balance you have to strike. And so, I'll leave it to you to kind of figure out that balance. But I mean, as much as possible, trying to kind of advocate for like, we would have a much more solid feeling about which direction to go in if we could just, do a test with even 10 people. We would probably learn a lot, right? Something like that. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I have something to add here because specifically he said like created dashboards and portals for internal employees. So I'm not sure if he's talking about his own company.
Right.
If that is the case, then potentially he could just walk around the office, right? Show it to people that would want or to like would use it or
Right.
have certain touch points. And that like if that's not the case, of course, scrap the feedback. But if that
Right.
is the case, then potentially show it to a bunch of people, and then like the stakeholder, no matter what, is going to give you, design input. Great, execute that version, but then be like, oh, but version B had all this other input, and this is the mock of version B, for example, right? Like, and then you can show like, okay, this is the one that you wanted, but this is the one that others wanted based on XYZ feedback. Here's the decisions I made. Which one like is accurate? Because maybe there's a hybrid version of that, right?
Yeah,
But
totally.
like if that's a resource, if it's like those folks inside your company that are the potential users, maybe they would also use it. Because I've definitely worked with a CEO that's like, I know exactly what the users want, or hear one customer comment, be like, we got to change the whole platform. And it's just like, it's painful. But what are you gonna do? It's the CEO, right?
I know, right? I know. so frustrating. It's one of the things that selfishly I enjoy being a consultant because I don't have to deal with any of the political stuff. And then usually because they've chosen to hire me and chosen to pay me, they just kind of trust me because they're like, well, we paid her all this money. She must be smart. And if we don't trust her, then it means we've done a bad job hiring someone. So like, let's just trust her. And so I don't usually get a lot of pushback because there's already so much buy-in, to kind of do this research. And so I just feel really badly for people who are working at companies who have to fight so hard to be able to do some simple research. So
Yeah. Okay, let's flash this one on the screen.
sure.
Credit asks, what might be the most important part of research when a company's look through the portfolio? For example, will it be the creativity of the research method?
It could be. I feel like that's not something I would look for personally. I mean, it's great to see, for example, like if you have a portfolio, it might be nice to see, one case study using interviews and one using usability testing and one using a survey, just kind of understand that this person knows a breadth of different research methods. They don't necessarily have to be creative. I feel like the more creative you get with your research methods, I feel like that's not necessarily, it can be a good thing, but I feel like, I feel like so much of my work is just pretty bread and butter, like user interviews and usability testing and stuff. I don't necessarily have to get too cute with like, whatever kind of fancy, little methods I use, but that could be cool. I think that, thinking about a portfolio, for me, the most important thing is like understanding your reasoning and like your critical thinking skills and how did you work through the problem? Again, like I was saying before, like what was the problem you were trying to solve through your research? How did you execute that? And what was the impact? That's what I would focus on.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Cool, great. Okay, we have another one here. I work on UX for a platform used by bank tellers who are serving customers face to face. Oh, awesome.
Mhm.
Any advice on testing/research on that kind of experience targeted at in-person customer service? Um, there are so many variables that it's really hard to isolate and test. I guess this was similar to your experience of like in person, the merchant is serving the customer using the platform.
Right.
Any advice here, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would say that, like, yeah, so in that situation that I was in, the thing we were testing, the person we were testing with didn't actually have to use it to serve a customer in that moment because I think that would just be too stressful for them. I would
Hmm.
say, I don't know exactly what sort of situation. Oh, also Elizabeth, so the other Elizabeth is in. But like, yeah, probably you're not going to really be able to like test, be there in the bank testing something on an actual bank customer for like confidentiality reasons, and also because the bank probably wants to keep their customers happy and not throw them into a usability test when they don't really know that that's happening. I to the best of your ability, being able to kind of simulate that experience could be helpful, like um and again, I don't know exactly what it is you're working on, but if there's some way that like another employee or something like that could kind of play the role of a customer and have them kind of ask a set of questions you guys have figured out to the bank teller or whatever, like trying to come up with scenarios. I find that like when I'm running some sort of testing, usually having people work through scenarios is a really helpful approach. So rather than just like, oh, explore this app or whatever, it's something like, imagine that a customer has just walked into the bank and they want to open an account. Can you like walk me through how you would open up an account for them using our app or whatever, right?
Hmm.
Again, I don't really know exactly what you're working on, but yeah, I mean, there are a lot of variables. It's hard to isolate and test, especially because you don't know what a customer is going to ask the teller. There's all sorts of situations that could come up. I'm sorry, I feel like I don't have a great answer for you, Elizabeth. But things get really complicated when it's something in person involving customers that could have a really broad set of questions, and also using confidential data like banking information where you can't just really like have them kind of use their real data with you. I feel like whenever I'm working on something sensitive, like anything related to banking or healthcare or whatever, I'm almost always having people use a mock account that's just set up for them to use, never entering their own personal information, for example, is usually
Mhm,
helpful.
mhm. No, I really
Yeah.
like that tip of like simulating that scenario and having one of your team members play a customer. So maybe it does simulate this sort of context of use where like
Mhm.
someone's in front of them, they need to do it quickly, not that much time to think, etc., right? Um, Interesting question here. What is the role of AI in the research process up to a final research summation? What models are used and how?
That's a good question. I mean, some people want to make AI the entire research process, right? Like there's certainly products that exist these days where you can have AI be your interviewer and you can even have AI be your users, right? Like you could just have an AI interviewer interviewing fake users, and some people will call that research. I'm not a big fan of that, partially because I get paid to do research. I don't want AI to do my research for me. I want to do it. I think that where, like, for myself, AI plays a really nice role as like an assistant in certain ways. One thing I might use it for is I might, for example, open up ChatGPT and maybe feed it a description of what sorts of people I'm trying to recruit for a study and have it come up with a set of screening questions as like a first input. So just as a draft, I never take anything from ChatGPT and cut and paste it. I always use it as like an idea generating thing. So maybe it comes up with a set of, 5 or 6 questions that could be useful for screening, and I might adjust those. Similarly, I might say something like, I have a set of user interviews coming up with, these sorts of people. Here are my top 5 research questions. Can you please write a 30-minute long interview guide with a set of questions I can ask these people? And again, I might take that as like kind of first input into myself writing my own discussion guide. Just gives me an idea for questions I might want to ask, and I can kind of tweak them. So yeah, I've found it useful for those sorts of things. I also, in data analysis, I mentioned I use Dovetail a lot, and Dovetail has like an AI theming feature, which I use. They also have a feature where Dovetail will actually go in and do all the highlighting and tagging for you in the transcripts. I don't find that very useful. It's not good enough. I find that, like, I've tried it. I actually did like a kind of an A/B test where I tried it, and I did it also myself. And when I tried it, I had to spend almost as much time going through and double checking its results and changing the tags and adding more highlights or whatever. So it actually wasn't saving me any time. The problem is some people will not do that extra work and they'll just kind of take it at face value and use it. I personally wouldn't. And AI can also be useful for, again, you maybe you run a survey and you have a bunch of survey data and you feed it in. And I'll do, for example, it's helpful for like word, like kind of like word clouds or things like that, where I'll be like, okay, here are 1,000 responses to this survey question. Please tell me the top 10 themes that came out of these responses and give me every single data point that contributes to that theme. I always make ChatGPT check its work because I don't trust it. Otherwise, it will give me so much bullshit, otherwise. So, it'll be like one theme was poor customer service, and then it'll list like 25 things people said about that, so I can actually check and be like, okay, that's reasonable. So yeah, that's some ways I've used it.
Okay, last question here before we let Elizabeth go. Any tips for conducting digital ethnography? Best use cases, pros and cons, and how to prep, tools, etc. This is a big question.
That's a big question. I mean, digital ethnography, like, I don't consider myself an ethnographer exactly. Like, I feel like in digital ethnography, I guess when you say, sorry, maybe Radhika can clarify. When you say like digital ethnography, do you maybe mean like diary studies, like digital diary studies? That could be a thing. Or do you mean like like heuristic analysis, or do you mean like getting into the person's context? Like, for example, like a type of digital ethnography could be I have a camera up in a restaurant and I'm observing chefs do their work and I'm kind of asking them questions or whatever. That's the sort of thing I'd probably do in person, actually. But I'm just going to answer as if this we're talking about diary studies, since we haven't talked about diary studies yet, and Radhika can clarify if needed. But yeah, diary studies are a really fun research method I don't get to use very often, where basically you set up a digital diary for someone to use, and basically, every day, for example, they're answering a certain set of prompts. This is useful for situations where your research question involves a longer span of time. So, for example, maybe you're interested in how people go about buying a car. Not everyone goes and buys a car like in the moment they think about buying a car, of course, right? And of course, you could ask people if in an interview after they bought a car, what was the process like, for sure. Oh, good. I'm glad I got that right, yep. Radhika, thank you. And so you might want to find out what the car buying process is like over a period of time, right? And so maybe every day or every couple of days or something, they get a little diary prompt asking them questions about like, oh, did you look at any cars today, or what questions were on your mind about car buying today? What websites did you go to? Whatever kind of things you're interested in, and you're kind of gathering data from them at multiple time points over maybe a couple of weeks or something like that, and then you can kind of go in and analyze their diary and kind of understand maybe the journey, like the user journey someone takes to for buying a car. So you'd probably want to run a lot of these diaries across a bunch of different people. And so if you want to do it really simply and cheaply, you can just set up a little survey on like SurveyMonkey or another free survey tool with your little prompt questions, and then use, I think Gmail has a tool called Boomerang or something to kind of automatically send out that email to the person every day or something, and just schedule, every day at 9 a.m. they get this email and they, submit their diary, and that can work really well. You can also use specialized diary study tools. D-Scout is one. It's really expensive. I've never used it, so you kind of have to work for a company that has an account. One that I have used is called Recollective, and that's a really cool tool. I think it's also probably expensive. I've never had to pay for it myself. I just have clients who have paid for it. But it's a really cool like diary study tool where like you can almost create like a community where you have people have a little account and you kind of send them prompts every day, and you might do exercises with them or have them watch videos and things like that. That's kind of a neat tool to use. The challenge with diary studies is, or there's a few challenges, but one is that you can get attrition. So basically people drop off over time, right?
Mhm.
Not everyone's motivated to do a diary for 2 weeks. They have good intentions at the beginning and then they kind of forget about it or they get bored. And so you usually have to incentivize them along the way. So maybe, every 3 or 4 days they're getting a smaller gift card and they get a bigger gift card at the end if they stick through the whole thing. It's also really intense, like data analysis wise, because you're collecting a lot of data, right? You're collecting data to these questions, over multiple days across multiple people. And it can just be really, really hairy to try to dig into that and analyze that. So you have to kind of have a lot of time available to do that. So it's a method that doesn't come up a lot for me because of the kind of money and time required for it. But it's really, really cool if you have questions about a more like longitudinal like process.
Yeah, that makes me want to do it with folks out there and UX designers, specifically
Yeah.
how they level up their career in UX. What do they do? What are their daily habits and stuff? So maybe it's something I'll think about and do a diary study
Yeah.
on all of you guys listening. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Before we let you go, I just want to say that folks really appreciated this, and they said thank you to you really as well. And I also, of course, want to give you some time to tell us what's going on in your world and how people can, stay up to date with what you're doing. So I will slide out, and you can take as much time as you want.
Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank my friends Roble and Drew for joining today. That was a nice surprise to see both of you here. Thank you all for the great questions. This was like much more fun than I expected. So I'm a UX research consultant. If you work at a company that could use some research help, please feel free to get in touch with me. Would love to jump in and help you out with some fun research and design problems. I also run trainings. I'm not running any currently, but I do have a Maven course called User Interview Skills for Designers and PMs. I actually am on maternity leave right now, but I'll probably end up running it towards the end of the year, maybe beginning of next year. I think it's a great course. It's got great reviews, kind of takes you through the entire process of planning and executing and analyzing user interviews, including a lot of practice interviewing other people in the class, which is kind of fun. I have a newsletter that I've been neglecting lately. If you go to newsletter.brazen.io, and I believe there's also just a link on my website somewhere, you can sign up for that. When you sign up, you get an automated email that has some free resources, like a free research plan template and some other stuff. So feel free to enjoy that. But I will say that I have not put out a newsletter issue in several months, and I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to start it up again. So don't be too surprised if you don't see something from me for a little while. But hopefully you can at least get something out of the free resources. Please feel free to get in touch with me through my website or on LinkedIn or whatever if you have any research needs coming up, or if you or your team wants to learn how to do research better. Thanks.
Awesome.
Oh, and thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, I on the baby. Yes, it's my second baby. He's 3 months old. He's great, but he's makes working and training people very difficult these days.
Yeah, lots of thanks from the folks tuning in. And obviously Elizabeth says, great name. Hi from Toronto. So not too far. Not too far
Yep.
from you, Elizabeth. Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for taking your morning to jump on this, and for the folks who are listening. I'm gonna wrap up, so feel free to drop off and I'll take you off stage. But it was a pleasure having you on, and I'm sure a lot of people got a lot of insights and sort of shared some nuggets about your expertise with them. So I'm sure they appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. So guys, go check out brazen.io or scan this QR code to figure out what Elizabeth is up to and all the stuff that she's got going on, her trainings, her consultancy, her newsletter, and an upcoming Maven course sometime in the future. Okay. So before we go, I want to tell you guys about the next live stream, which you can subscribe here. And we're going to be talking about how to use behavioral psychology in UX. So everything behavioral psychology, like must know UX psychology principles, how to design for behaviors and biases, small tweaks to make a huge impact on your product. And this will be next week. Let me just flash that date. The date is Wednesday next week, whatever the day is. Is it next week? It isn't next week. Sorry, it's the 17th. So Wednesday, the 17th. I'm just kind of editing that myself there. Yep, there we go. So check that out by subscribing to either one of the QR codes, and you'll just get notified on events only. So if you want to learn about psychology and how psychology affects design decisions and principles, and what are the small tweaks that you could do right now to any product experience that could potentially make a huge impact based on these principles, then subscribe. I hope you enjoyed today's session. And like always, you can check out stuff from uxplaybook.org for all of the resources. Again, get notified here. And that's everything from me. So thank you guys for joining. And this is always fun. I also I'm thinking about doing an office hours, maybe once a month to start, but it's going to be zero video, just audio, where you guys actually can speak and ask me questions. And it'll be more of a casual format. So like any question you want, maybe sometimes we have guests, maybe we won't, but it's just a casual format. Let me know in the chat if that sounds like something fun. Whereas just you'll get me for an hour every month and it's just office hours. So imagine like speaking to your design manager or a colleague about anything that's going on at work, how to solve it, my experience or how I solved it, and just chat life stuff. So it could be from portfolio building to growing in your career, to management, to like a design problem. How do I solve this? Or politics at work, toxic manager, whatever it is, right? And see if me or any of the other folks on that sort of audio space has anything to add and to help you. Sometimes if you're the only designer on a design team, it's lonely. I've been there. So, this is office hours. If that's good, if you guys are into it, I will start that and I'll commit to at least once a month, maybe twice a month. Let's see how it goes. All right. Sounds cool. All right. That's awesome. Well, I think that's everything from me. So until next time, bye. This is the design of everyday people.
It sound right, boy.
This is the design of everyday people.